I'm reading from this book, Securing America's Covenant with God, from America's foundations in the early 1600s to America's post-Civil War recovery in the late 1800s by Huntley Hodges. This is America, the Covenant Nation, a Christian perspective. I was in this chapter, The Birth of the American Republic. I was reading from the middle of it. And it says, the strong Christian component in the discussions at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. The example also of ancient Israel. These men were also aware of another example of an ancient people who had tried to be self-ruling, similar to what the Americans were trying to do. The constitutional framers were quite well read up on the Bible and were very aware of the sad record of the ancient Israelites in their efforts to stay a strong yet free people. Indeed, as Christians, the framers were very well aware that human sin, pride, jealousy, lust for power, etc., stood as a constant threat to any effort to empower a central authority. For generations, God alone was ancient Israel's sovereign. The Israelites had called on him time and again to protect and preserve them against their enemies, foreign and domestic, but their loyalties to God were most unsteady. Finally, at one point, the people called out to their spiritual leader Samuel. This is, quote, "Give us a king," end quote. They felt that they could be more successful as a people if they were more like the other nations around them, ruled not by some invisible God, but by a very visible, very politically impressive God, a king. But through the counsel of Samuel, Israel was warned by God himself that their effort to have a government like other nations would be their downfall. But they wanted a king to rule over them nonetheless, and so God gave them a king. But as Samuel had predicted, in this move away from God, the Israelites soon fell under the political tyranny of their kings. The kings took away the Israelites' liberties and amassed considerable wealth and power of their own at the expense of the people. The Protestant component. This was exactly what the American colonists had felt had come to pass with the English kings. The English kings had tried to take the place in the life of the nation that belonged only to God. This effort of the kings to play God, claiming divine rights to do so, was what had finally prompted their revolt, the War of Independence. All Americans, as Protestant Calvinists, New England Congregationalists, Reformed Dutch, Middle Colonies, Presbyterians, etc., Baptists, Quakers, and even as Church of England vestrymen, were well understood that they too had divine rights which no king had the right to disregard or trample on. Indeed, in one form or another, nearly all of those who assembled to draft this new venture into Republican government were Christians, Protestant Christians. They were politically informed by their own sense of the longer history of the Church. Protestantism was very aware of the fact that prior to the adoption of Christianity by the Roman emperors in the 300s, Christianity has been a free religion under no central political control, but self-governing by small communities of believers themselves in accordance with their strongly Christian moral consciousness and ingrained spiritual beliefs. The Christians of the first 3 centuries of the Church had survived terrible persecution from the Roman political authorities, and yet not only had kept themselves together as a people, but had grown rapidly at the same time. Pure Christianity needed no hierarchical authority to organize and direct the faith of the true believer. But with the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine to Christianity in the early 200s, Christianity had become Romanized. That is brought under the political organization and protection of the Roman political hierarchy. From the Protestant point of view, this was a horrible step backward for the Christian faith. For this development, it made the faith henceforth a matter more of the political interests of the politically powerful than that of the personal faith of the individual believer. Protestantism was fiercely sensitive on this subject. Thus, the framers tended to be strongly anti-hierarchical in both their religion and their politics. The Puritan Protestant predecessors of the framers had lived in terror of the forced Catholicization of England, which the Catholic powers of Europe, principally their perpetual enemies, Spain and France, sought to promote. The sending of the Spanish Armada to England in 1588 was loudly justified by Spanish King Philip II as a result of God's command to him as a defender of the faith to bring the English back to the true faith, Catholicism, by force if necessary. The humiliating defeat of Philip's mighty naval armada therefore ranked not only as a victory for English independence, but also as victory in the defense of their Protestant faith. This conflict with the Spanish consequently left an even deeper dislike of hierarchical Catholicism among Protestant Englishmen, In part, the Glorious Revolution in England a century later was prompted by the evidence that English King James II was secretly Catholic, and loyalties in planning an alliance with Catholic France to crush the power of the highly Protestant English Whigs who controlled Parliament. Protestantism as a political culture, thus the Protestant faith of the English colonists, was a matter of a great political, economic, and social importance to them. Their personal freedom and their religious faith were to them inseparable items. As Protestants, they chose their own pastors, elected their own elders and deacons to manage their local congregations, read and interpret their Bibles, readings on their own, without a priest performing the function for them, and came to their own opinions on theological matters themselves as a matter of their basic rights. This was a matter of a great personal distinction to them. Indeed, not only was the idea of having their lands to the west put under Catholic hierarchical authority that reached to Rome, but also the idea which was being discussed openly by King George III of putting the English colonies under the authority of the Anglican bishops, which the king himself personally supervised, had been one of the underlying reasons they finally declared their independence from the English king in 1776. Their Protestant faith registered itself not only in terms of the things they opposed, namely hierarchically controlled religion, but the things that they aspired to. Their Republican instincts were shaped strongly by the way their churches operated. Their church officers were elected by the congregation on a regular basis, and at least on the part of the very strong Presbyterian component among them. They even developed regional representative government in the form of their senates, attended by pastoral and lay representatives. Ultimately, community life, both religious and civil, by long-established habit, was to their understanding always governed from the ground up, not the top down. They strongly conceived of government as being collegial rather than hierarchical. Generations of them had lived and died for this principle. They would have it no other way. God as the guarantor of the success of the America's New Republic. Indeed, the constitutional framers who gathered at Philadelphia in 1787 saw themselves as and their challenge very much operating within the context of God's will. They were very well aware that God Almighty, which is the fashion of the times, they often referred to as quote Protestants. This is referred to as quote providence, end quote, and in quote the one who provides, end quote, was the one empowered that had enabled them recently to succeed in their very risky revolt. Apart from the direct and frequent assistance from God, it would have been highly unlikely that a handful of mere commoners could have ever succeeded on their own in a revolt against a powerful king and his army. They knew well and testified often to the fact that only God had made the success of the American revolt possible. They all understood that it was not the size of the American army nor the cleverness of their generals, but it was the hand of God operating among them that had brought them successfully through these trying times. Ben Franklin's reminder. At one point in late June of 1787, during the heated debates in Philadelphia over what kind of government they had been commissioned to create, Ben Franklin arose to address the assembly with a proposal that seemed amazingly out of character for the great champion of earthly wisdom, namely that the group should start each of its daily deliberations in prayer. So, Mr. President, the small progress we have made after 4 or 5 weeks, close attendance, and continual reasoning with each other, our different sentiments on almost every question, several of the last producing as many noes and nays, and methinks a melancholy proof of the imperfection of the human understanding. We indeed seem to feel our own want of political wisdom. Some we have been running about in search of it. We have gone back to ancient history for models of government and examined the different forms of those republics which have been formed with the seeds of their own dissolution now no longer exists, and we have viewed modern states all around Europe, but find none of their constitutions suitable for our circumstances. In this situation of the assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, but scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understandings? In the beginning of the contest with G. Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for the divine protection. Our prayers, sir, we heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of His superintending providence in our favor. To that kind of providence we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future national felicity? And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? I have lived for a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth that God governs in the affairs of man. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, it is probable that an empire can rise without his aid. We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings that except the Lord build a house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. We shall be divided by our little partial local interests. Our projects will be confounded, and we ourselves shall become a reproach and byword down to future ages. And what is worse, mankind may hereafter, from this unfortunate instance, despair of establishing governments by human wisdom and leave it to chance, war, and conquest. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations he held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business, and that one or more of the clergy of the city be requested to officiate in that service. And thus Franklin, the widely respected voice of American pragmatic wisdom, summed up the situation that faced the designers of America's new political system. Madison, who recorded the events of the convention, including Franklin's speech, noted that the motion was seconded by Roger Sherman, but met by a concern voiced by Alexander Hamilton that in taking up this policy at this late date in the process, people would interpret this resolution as merely the result of the embarrassments and dissensions among the delegates, which was indeed the case. Randolph of Virginia then came to the support of the Franklin proposal, with a motion of his own specifying how this resolution was to be enacted, but the business of the day ended without any vote on Randolph's motion. We cannot state that the Constitutional Convention at this point then turned itself into a gathering of some kind of saintly religious synod, but clearly all present understood the significance of what Franklin had just brought to their attention. In the end, what would guarantee his wisdom and durability of this constitutional enterprise rested ultimately not on the flawed and contentious wisdom of man, but instead on the mercies of the God that provides for his people, especially in guiding their thoughts and actions. Furthermore, the matter at hand was not just one of providing the 13 states with some kind of political formula for cooperation, but was, as it had always been, that of building a test society, a demonstration model founded especially to give hope to all mankind that a people's government was not only possible but also able to stand strong against forces that would like to return the little people, the commoners of the earth, back under the domination of the high and mighty. Thus, there could be no failure in this important enterprise. The framers understood the dangers of building only on human logic, so Franklin's appeal registered itself as strongly as it did because all present knew well the biblical story of the fall of Adam and Eve from God's paradise. Adam and Eve had ignored God's warning not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, human logic, but instead had followed the serpent's advice to do exactly that because it would make them be like God. The temptation to play God as assuming for themselves the knowledge of good and evil was too great for Adam and Eve to resist, but in breaking that command, disaster struck. What they got for their efforts was only half truth, the most dangerous of all lies. Apart from the fundamental guidance of God, their logic could not guide them except in merely self-justifying circles. They did not produce true knowledge. Their logic was only technique, not truth itself. Truth came from a deeper source of life, from a depth that human logic itself could never reach. Only a close, fully trusting relationship with the author of life, life's basic truths as God ordained them, offered true knowledge, but by their disobedience, by their questioning for knowledge apart from God, Adam and Eve had ruptured that vital relationship. They were on their own, with their own sophistication, as in the sophistication of the sophists of ancient Athens. But this sophistication only made them all the more aware of life's shortcomings, especially in others, whom they blamed for their problems. Ultimately, this broken relationship with God ended in death, and their death not a pretty picture. The framers understood very well the moral of the story. Human logic was not the answer to life's challenges. Relationship holding together in the spirit of unity and holding to God as the ultimate judge and ruler of life was the path they needed to follow. The better way would come if they were willing to submit their particular self-interest and the moral and tactical logic man used in defense of those self-interests in support of the greater bond that held them together as Americans under God. What they ultimately formulated as their new American government was a rather simple alliance system that encouraged them to work together without according to many powers to the system itself. This new federal system was their response to the challenge. Even then they knew that this new system would work only if man's hunger for power, as Adam and Eve's desire to play God, was held in check. A deep respect for and even fear of God among the people was the only way they felt that things might stay on course as they faced the many challenges ahead of them. This was a component missing in the logical systems of philosophers, ancient and modern. It was not missing in the thinking of the framers of the Constitution. In fact, it held a central or foundational place in their understanding of things. States, for my own part, I sincerely esteem the Constitution, a system which without the finger of God never could have been suggested and agreed upon by such a diversity of interests. Alexander Hamilton, 1787. Of all the dispositions and the habits which lead to a political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports, and let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. George Washington, Farewell Address, 1796. We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, and revenge, and gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. John Adams, to the Massachusetts Militia, October 11th, 1798. The belief in a God, all-powerful, wise, and good, is so essential to the moral order of the world and to the happiness of man that arguments which enforce it cannot be drawn from too many sources, nor adapted with too many solicitude to the different characters and capacities to be impressed with it. James Madison, letter to Frederick Bazley, November 20th, 1825. Comparing the Christian American and secular French efforts at republic building in the late 1700s. Contrast the American approach to self-government in 1787 with the French Revolution, which broke out 2 years later in 1789. Just as the American Constitution went into effect, the French were led simply by their belief in the power of human reason or logic, especially their own logic, that is, the logic of their political leaders, which they supposed would produce a platonically perfect French republic. God played no part in their plans of the French reformers. Indeed, their mood was generally hostile to the idea of God, whom they frequently mocked, for they understood liberty as freedom from religion. They viewed religion, their Christian faith in particular, as a key component of the very old order that they were bent on overthrowing. They were determined to be ruled not by God, but by man's basic ability to do the right thing, the logical thing. But when finally, with the eruption of the French Revolution in 1789, given the chance to put their philosophy to practice, the French revolutionaries could not agree among themselves as to what exactly constituted the right thing, the reasonable or logical thing. One man's logic was not another man's logic. Soon they fell from their idealism into mutually hostile intellectual camps, and then proceeded to bring each other to slaughter under the French guillotine, the Reign of Terror, 1792 through 1794. Ultimately, their attempt to found their new system on the belief in the great powers of human reason, but such reason provided the assurance that the system would work harmoniously, resulted only in disaster, so their experiment in republican democracy proved ultimately no successful in producing utopia than the ancient Athenian democracy when it came under the ideological domination of the sophists. Finally, the dictatorship of Napoleon in 1799 through 1815 brought the French under some kind of political order. It took a new form of tyranny to rescue them from the tyranny of unrestrained human self-interest, and the reason or logic used to justify such self-interest. So much for human reason and the idealistic belief that man's reason opened the way to some kind of absolute truth and goodness. Yet it would be a sophisticated belief that would never seem to die, despite the ugly historical record of man's continuing attempts to build utopias on the basis of human reason alone. The framers of the Constitution, for the most part, were very aware of such potential dangers, Thus, the American Revolution they presided over, suspicious of unrestrained human behavior, and thus consciously minimalist in its utopian efforts, succeeded awesomely in creating a viable republic, whereas the French Revolution failed miserably.